Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy. We're going to be talking about how individuals in the past lost their identities, and so how they moved from being a person with an ethnicity, a clan, a culture, to just being individuals who were identified according to a color. And so individuals took on identities, or identities were given to them, where they became what might be known as flat black and flat white, versus being a part of an actual clan, attached to a name, being a part of a culture, being a part of an actual ethnicity. And we're going to use the Irish, the Iberians, to actually demonstrate this so that you can see how and why individuals took on these identities that were related to color. And those are the identities that people have today. They are based upon these colors that give a certain social status. And you will see how people transitioned, and also these depictions that were used to dehumanize groups of people so that they would reject their own identities. As a starting point, we're going to look at some depictions so that you can see how the identities of certain groups of people were tied together. And those identities were tied together so that there would be a distinction drawn between certain identities and certain other identities, to create this sense of one identity being more valuable, more desirable, more treasured than the other. We're going to start off by looking at these depictions on the screen. You see there are three depictions. You see one to the left, and that's somebody who's supposed to be Irish Iberian. In the middle, you see someone who's supposed to be Anglo, and then on the right-hand side, you see someone who is supposed to be Negro. Now, part of the reason for this depiction that you see is there's an attempt to demonstrate the similarities between the Irish Iberian and the Negro phenotype, and also to distinguish those two groups in terms of phenotype from the Anglo phenotype that's in the middle. And part of the reason for this is the history of the Irish Iberian is supposed to trace back to a quote-unquote African race thousands of years ago. And there's the belief that this quote-unquote African race or Negroid race spread over Western Europe, and you can find artifacts and all sorts of history behind this in Ireland, in Scotland. And there's also, in terms of this depiction that you see, there's an attempt to also suggest that one group in the middle is superior to both groups on the side. Now we're going to look at how the depictions on both ends look more similar when you put them together, and you can see how there was this conflation of those identities. And you can see here how the illustrator was attempting to point out the similarities with respect to these two phenotypes. This is from back in 1899. And looking at how the Irish have been depicted over time and how those individuals who were classified as Negro have been depicted over time, what you're going to see is that the depictions have been very similar, and the depictions have been very inhumane based upon presenting both groups as inhuman. And what people are missing in many instances is the fact that you're often talking about the same people. And so those that you would consider to be quote unquote Negro were also the same people that you would consider to be quote unquote Irish. And that's why these depictions were used in an interchangeable fashion, and also the narratives about the people were used in an interchangeable fashion. They would often be presented in these ways that you see on the screen based upon Childish Gambino's depiction in This Is America. In the Irish Stereotypes in Vaudeville book, one of the things that you will note is that there were parallels between Irish stage stereotypes during that time and blackface entertainment. And often you would have individuals who were identified as either African or Irish presenting in blackface. And you would also see this dynamic where both characters were presented in a way that was a buffoon-like character. The individuals were considered lazy, presented as constantly being jolly and silly and childlike and immature and not using what they considered then to be correct English. You had these two characters, one was Patty and one was Sambo, to make this presentation. But again, these presentations were largely interchangeable. And here you see more modern depictions of this Patty Sambo dynamic, this stereotype. And you see it with Childish Gambino's character in This Is America and also with Uncle Ruckus. The discussion goes on to point out that both Irish characters and quote unquote black characters were both performing in blackface. And so part of the reason for this was so that the Irish character would be presented in the same way as the quote unquote black character, but they were both presented as dark-skinned others. And that's a part of that dynamic of othering. They were both considered non-white. And so you also had the Patty character being presented as the biggest fool that ever walk in terms of this language that's used here. And part of this was to add to this minstrel type of dynamic for both the Irish and for those who were identified as African descendant. And because individuals who were considered indigenous to America, those who were considered as being transplants from Africa, those who were considered being transplants from India, and those coming over from Ireland, those were all seen as one big group. And so you would see them often being treated in a way that was interchangeable and being identified in an interchangeable way. But the big umbrella under which they were all sitting was this idea of being a dark-skinned other. In many ways, the Childish Gambino character in This Is America was sort of a hearkening back to the time of Jim Crow and also hearkening back to these depictions of Irish people. And so you had Childish Gambino being presented as this brute force who was extremely violent, uncontrolled in the depictions in This Is America. And you will see how there was this attempt to present Irish people in this way also, but also presenting them stereotypically as primates, as monkeys or apes or gorillas. And you can again then see how there was this attempt to tie together these fantasized identities related to darker skinned people. We're going to start with this depiction that encompasses so many things. And so the title that you see at the bottom is related to rum and riot, suggesting that alcohol and rioting go together for those who are considered Irish. And you see in small writing, it says brutal attack on the police the day we celebrate Irish riot. And so the individuals who are identified as Irish are the ones who are wearing the sashes and the large hats, and brutalizing the ones who are under them, who are representing the police. And so what this was doing was suggesting that the Irish were uncontrolled, uncontrollable, that they were engaged in riots. And also, if you look at the depictions, the ones who are identified as the police look human, and then the individuals who are identified as the Irish look animalistic, and by animalistic meaning wild animals, not human. And what this did was it played into this idea that the Irish people were beast-like. And so therefore there was no belief that they should be treated with human dignity. These depictions went along with a systematic process of discrimination against Irish people. And so often in job ads, there would be a notation of "No Irish need apply." Not only were the men presented as violent and beast-like, you also had the same dynamic going on in terms of these depictions of Irish women. And so they would often be contrasted with what would be identified as quote unquote English women or proper English women. And so you would see Irish women being depicted as larger than life, very violent, very aggressive. And here again, you see this presentation of Irish women, with one on the left-hand side being presented as Florence Nightingale. And so this genteel female on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, this depiction of quote unquote an Irish woman, and she's identified as Bridget McBruiser. And so again, that violent persona is being pushed out in terms of Irish Iberian women. And here you see additional depictions of individuals who were supposed to be representing what it meant to be Irish. And again, you see individuals with very exaggerated features. You also see individuals who are dressed in a very either gaudy manner or a very dowdy manner. And you also see a woman who is larger than the man and presenting in a relatively aggressive sort of manner, standing there. And here again, you see the Irish being presented in a very negative light, again, for both the male and the female, with again these very exaggerated features that do not look quite human. And here you see another depiction of what's supposed to be an Irish man, again becoming out of control in relation to drinking alcohol. And here you see a presentation of an Irishman depicted as a gorilla, labeled Mr. G. O'Rilla. And again, you can see where there is this attempt to present the Irish as beast-like, wild, inhuman, and out of control. And again, you see these depictions continue on with this presentation of the Irish as being gorilla-like. And here you see the Irish being presented as seditious, again inciting violence. And so there was this theme of the Irish being presented as not human, beast-like, violent, out of control, and not deserving of human regard. And these bizarre depictions continue here. You can see this is really an ethnic clashing here, because you have the British being presented as the lion, being regal, being the king of the jungle, wearing a crown. And you see the Irish being presented as little monkeys. And you even see the little hat that is suggesting one is a trickster. And so you see this contrast that is being presented to suggest that the British are deserving of very good treatment, royal treatment, whereas the Irish people were deserving of nothing similar to that. Again, here you see this depiction where the Irish are presented as, again, beast-like, sitting on top of a rum barrel, out of control, again, asking who's boss. And here you see additional depictions on the left and the right. Again, very beast-like. On the left-hand side, you see this contrast again with someone defending this female against what would be considered the brute force of this Irishman, who is again being presented as being animal-like. And then on the right-hand side, you see this anti-Irish dynamic where the Irish are presented as very violent again, but also larger than life. And so beast-like, violent, and larger than life. And here you see on the right-hand side, Childish Gambino presenting as very brute in terms of having brute force. And then on the left-hand side, you see another depiction that's supposed to represent the Irish that's very similar with this brute force dynamic. You see the individual as being presented as, again, very animal-like or very beast-like, also very violent and out of control. And here you have another depiction. This time the person is presented as having some sort of authority, but still, even in this depiction, the individual is presented as beast-like. Now, the depictions did not just stop with men and women, and they often involved children. And so Irish children were presented as being out of control. They were beyond the redemption of the church, according to these illustrations. Again, very violent and beyond the control of adults. Now, this depiction is laden with so many dynamics. We're not going to have time to get into all of them in this discussion, but what you can see here is this depiction of a scale, and on balance, you have these two individuals who are presented as equal, one representing the North, one representing the South, one representing quote-unquote Negro, the other one representing Irishman. One of the things that you will see in this equal dynamic is the Irishman again is being presented as the quote-unquote white person, but also presented as the dark other, and again presented as very animal-like, even in the context of the person on the left-hand side who's supposed to be representing quote-unquote Negro or black person. And here, this illustrator just goes directly to that point and writes mutual, suggesting that the primate in the cage is equal to the man who is identified as the Irishman. Those depictions should help you to better understand why individuals might have been working so hard to distance themselves from the Irish identity. And so you will recall from our previous discussion that this depiction on the screen is the typical Black Irish in Jamaica. However, there were some individuals who were working very diligently to distance themselves from those depictions that you saw, and also the discrimination that Irish individuals experienced. And so in attempting to distance self from that, many individuals were working towards simply becoming what is known as flat white. And so they lost their ethnic identity, they lost their nationality, they lost their clan identity by taking on a color identity. And then on the flip side, you have individuals who were darker, who also lost their Irish identity, and their identity was transformed to, again, a color identity and sometimes a misappropriation of other cultures. And so those individuals would often be stripped of their Irish identity and be told that they were African, or that they were simply Negro or Black or colored. And either way you look at it, you have groups of people who essentially lost their identities. And even today, those individuals, whether they are identifying as white or identifying as Black, they have been lost for the most part in terms of their identity, understanding their histories, understanding their ancestry, and the meaning of that for them. And so they've given up being ethnic people for being simply a color. And of course, the reason for doing that is that there was the belief for some, for those who identified as flat white, there was the belief that they would get privileges that would go along with distancing themselves from being Irish and then just sort of passing into what would be considered white culture and white identity. And for those who passed into Black culture, it wasn't done voluntarily. It was something that was pushed on those individuals to give up their Irish identity and simply become flat Black. So what has been going on historically is that as individuals have attempted to shed that Irish identity, there has been an attempt to take on a more Nordic identity. And we've talked about this in previous discussions. And so leaving that Irish identity behind, part of the dynamic has been attempts to move towards the identities that you see on the screen in terms of phenotype. And by moving in this direction, it gave individuals some distance from what was perceived as a very negative identity, and also an identity that came with a lot of discrimination and a lot of lack of privilege. And so over time, individuals have stopped identifying as Irish in many instances and simply identified as white, as a way of indirectly appropriating the identity that you see on the screen. And here you can see the contrast between individuals who have what's considered a more stereotypical Nordic phenotype and those individuals who have a lighter Irish phenotype. You can still see again with those who are identified as lighter Irish, they still have the black hair, coarse hair, hair that's coily often. And so those are some things that distinguish them from the Nordic phenotype that individuals who have given up their ethnicity for whiteness, you see the distinctions here. It may not be as clear when you just see individuals, but that distinction is there. But what you do see is that there have been movements over time for individuals to quote unquote bleach out and become closer to what is considered a Nordic phenotype, because that is something that presents more distance from those depictions and illustrations that you were seeing. And it also presents a way of becoming more distant from what is considered a quote unquote African or Negroid phenotype. And that is why you have families that have been separated based upon going in different directions. And so you will see Collins who are light and Collins who are dark. You will see McDermotts who are light and McDermotts who are dark. You will see Burkes and Walshes who are light and Burkes and Walshes who are dark. And you will often not even know that they are originally from the same family. As we wrap this up, it's important to remember that in spite of the discussions that are currently going on about all of this racial division, that the paradigms related to race are inconsistent with historical reality. Race is about family. Race is about clanship. Race is about your tribe. Race is about your ancestry. It's about the people that you are close to culturally and genetically. And what has been going on for such a long period of time is that people have been divorced from reality, as they have pretended to not even be related to the people that they are related to, and instead pretending that they have a kinship to people that they often don't even have a kinship to. And so as these conversations continue on locally, nationally, internationally, you can keep in mind the fact that your race, just like everyone else's race, is really tied to your lineage. And that is the important thing to keep in mind, is who is your family. And sometimes in these discussions, people lose sight of the fact that what you are talking about is actually having not division across color lines, but you are really talking about division across family lines. And that is what has been pushed for hundreds of years now, in order to create this bizarre paradigm related to skin color and race. People have literally had racial division, meaning family division, in order to keep this fictitious paradigm going. Remember, knowledge is power.